Okay, so so let's just look at the Linux tutorial. What Linux and Unix is essential for a lot of software development. I guess people still do. I mean, people do Windows programming and stuff and whatnot, right? But in research projects, I guess you really need to be familiar using Linux. Does anybody here? Can you think of any projects where you don't use Linux or Unix? Maybe there are, but for a lot of the work we do, you have to be familiar using Linux. We are, by the way, there's a broader impacts project that's led. Dr. Lundgren is leading, exploring a new class 224 EE 224. We are proposing some major changes in our curriculum for where we are going to introduce a class 224 where Linux is going to be a fundamental skill that you learn right off the bat. So we are a little weak in our program in terms of preparing to use Linux. So this module here tries to help you get started in Linux. It says install Linux. You don't need to install Linux if you already have Linux in your machine. If you don't, many of our students, our system administrators don't like us to install Linux, so they do it for you. But you can install Linux. Learning the command line. There are a lot of tutorials on learning how to be familiar on the command line. This semester, those of you in my 323 class, I'd help people, and I was just surprised how people struggle and don't feel comfortable in the command line. You should just feel like you are at home in the Linux command line. And so I would go through this tutorial here. There's a number of really good Linux tutorials to just feel comfortable, quickly browsing through the directories, managing the file system, running command. That should just be secondhand nature to you. So there's a whole bunch of links here. There's an activity where we explored some activities here. If you click here, this is, match each Linux command with its function. Now this should probably be, this is like a 15-second activity here, but we're trying to work with it here to make sure you're familiar with the various commands. But after you've gone through these tutorials, you can do this simple activity as well. There are a lot of other Linux resources available here for you. If the ones you like, if there's one that's missing, propose a pull request after you learn how to do that tomorrow and the next day to add a resource. You have some other setting up your environment here. You should have, at least the students in our lab all have administrator privileges on your computers. I don't know if you guys provide student administrator privileges for their machines. So using update, installer, install an editor. You want to learn a little bit about SSH to connect and SCP and keys. And you can use SSH config to save SSH privileges. There's another activity here at the end. Learn the purpose of these functions here. So we're not going to spend a lot of time interactively teaching you about Linux, but today I'd like you to spend 3 to 4 hours, 2 to 4 hours becoming more familiar with Linux. Does anybody here not have access to a Linux computer? Who has access to a Linux-based computer? How do you guys feel about your Linux skills? Just roughly, raise your hand if it's very new to you and it's unfamiliar. It's okay. Don't be embarrassed. Okay, that's okay. If you feel a little, raise your hand if you feel like moderate success, like you feel like you can get around. Anyone here feel like they're an expert in Linux? A couple of you. Okay. Good, that's okay. So even those of you that feel like you're an expert or moderate, we'd like you to spend a little bit of time really developing your Linux skills. Learn about a shell, learn about a new command, maybe learn about the processes, how they work.
When you talk about downloading Linux and having access to a Linux machine, like if I'm running Windows, are you talking about completely changing my OS or just downloading Git bash?
What we meant is that your lab, so in our lab, students have a dedicated computer that has Linux on it. Okay. If you have a lab machine, we have Linux machines in like the digital lab are all Linux, and you're welcome to go in there and do those exercises there, although you don't have administrative privileges on those machines. You can install Linux on your laptop and do a boot. Even if you have Windows, you can use WSL. I don't know. So if your research, if you don't have access to Linux, I wouldn't recommend necessarily, unless you absolutely need it for your research, don't install Linux on your machine unless you really need it. Although you can for fun. You can use one of the lab computers, the digital lab for Linux. Any other? Yes.
So you could also use a virtual machine. That's
You
something.
can use a virtual machine as well, which is what on my Mac. On my Mac, I use it. I don't think I know. It's that WCell where it's actually built into Windows. You can install that. Or on my Mac, I actually run VMware and I run Linux as a virtual machine as well. I shut it off because sometimes it just drains my battery. So I suspended my virtual machine. I won't waste your time showing that there, but you could do it. But it would be a good thing to do. If you don't have Linux, I would encourage you just to install it so that you can just become familiar with it.
What are some of a few key examples of what Linux can do that can't be done on another operating system that we would do?
Oh boy, let me say this. You probably can do everything in another operating system. But in Linux, you've got a lot more control. You have a lot more control than you do in other operating systems, and it's a lot more obvious what's going on. It's very clear the way you manage the operating. You can see the details of the operating system and manipulate the operating system in a way you can't in others. With Windows, you can make settings and stuff, but there's all these registries and things, and you can mess it up. And it's people doing serious development tend to work in Linux because you can control the environment a lot more than you can. Now, having said that, there are people who disagree with me on that. I don't know, professors, want to answer that question?
It's really customizable, right?
Very customizable.
Right, and I think like you said, like you can see all the details. There's commands you can run that will show you exactly what's happening.
And you can fix things a lot easier.
It's just generally way faster to do development. If you depend on some other open source software package, generally you just apt-get on the command line and get it. I mean, in Windows, it might be there, but you probably need to go to the web page. You need to download the installer. You need to run the installer. You need to figure out where it got installed. You need to go add it to your path variable, all these kind of extra steps that just make it a bit clunkier. You can do almost the same things, but really development's just a lot faster on Linux. So, and a lot of the tools you may find, you may want to use other open source tools that exist, and you'll probably find that like 90% plus just only have bothered to support Linux because that's what they're using to develop it themselves. So,
in our lab, we actually the systems we have run Linux. So we have little FPGAs that are running Linux, and so we don't have Windows running on those. And so if you're only using Windows, then you're going to be unfamiliar on these embedded. A lot of embedded systems are based on maybe not necessarily Linux per se, but sort of
probably not going to have Windows on your Raspberry Pi.
You're
So
not going to have Windows. So it also a lot of it used for a lot of embedded and real-time systems as well. Any other comments on Linux versus the importance of learning Linux? Like I say, we feel like that we need to put that in our curriculum, so we're going to be moving that to a 200 level class. I know we teach the digital lab. We switched to the Linux just only last year. We used to always be doing Windows, and so we're trying to help you develop these skills because a lot of the other things we're going to be doing this semester or in boot camp are going to be all done on Linux. So if you're not comfortable in Linux, you'll struggle. And I encourage you all boot camp long, continue to learn like a new Linux, learn about a new command or a new every day or something like that. That would be just a good thing to invest in your okay, anything else on Linux? So we'd like you to spend, a couple of hours just really becoming familiar with Linux and make that a habit of just learn something new in Linux so that you feel comfortable and familiar when you get to a Linux command.